study about a year ago. As well as shear wave elastography. So talking after Shantanu and Usha and my mentor is a little bit of a task, but I'll try to keep up a little bit. This is work that I've done in Zurich at the Balkanist University Clinic, and soon I hope to, I will join the University of Padova, so I'm very happy to be here today. There's something going on. Okay. And we'll go. No, we're good. We're good. We're good. So I had a chance in the last year to work on some athletes of the Swiss ski team. So I went to the competitors for a bit, it was a big project with the kinematics is an injury prevention, but I had the chance basically to work with some ultrasound imaging on 42 of the national team athletes and 107 from the youth teams. And what I was interested was mostly muscle architecture of the biceps femoris long head, and I will tell you why in a second. And then I worked also on some project regarding shear wave elastography made also on the biceps femoris long head. And the reason was because my boss, Jörg Spörli, in Zurich, was interested in mechanism of injury prevention. So this is actually something very, very common in skiing, and it's called the land back weighted mechanism of injury. So basically what happens is that the skier is jumping and he is in the flying phase. And in the flying phase, he goes a little bit back with his weight. He doesn't do this on purpose, of course, but it's very, very difficult to regain momentum and to go on the back. So if he lands on the tail of the skis, what happens is that he creates some forces that make an ACL rupture occurring. So what's happening is that the tibia, the foot is fixed in the boot, right? The weight is going to the back, and then the tibia goes in front. There is 45% of incidents in professional skiers of ACL injury. So if you are a skier that does it professionally for race, you have to take into account that you will injure your ACL probably once in your lifetime, if not more. But that's what he was interested in. And so we said, there are some studies, actually, early studies from Walter Herzog that show and suggest that the hamstrings muscle group is potentially important for this, because when activated, it can take back the patella and the shift of the tibia. So we were interested in this muscle group. And why am I interested in biceps femoris long head? Well, this is an extended field of view ultrasound that I've done in 50%. You see semimembranosus, semitendinosus, biceps femoris long head, and this is the short head right here. So the reason why we chose biceps femoris long head is because there are some studies suggesting that is very trainable, is very susceptible to train to eccentric or either concentric training or to different training modalities. Now I have to introduce architecture, okay, muscle architecture. What we mean with muscle architecture. So this is an ultrasound image of the vastus lateralis muscle. These are the two tendon aponeurosis. These are the fascicles that are bundles of myofibrils, right? And fibers, myofibrils, and so on. And what happens is that we can, with imaging, with analysis softwares, we can analyze the nation angle, the length of the fascicles, and the muscle thickness, so to have an idea of how big is the muscle. So what happens is, why is important muscle architecture? Because muscle architecture shows the plasticity of how a muscle responds to or adapts to different scenarios, to training scenarios, or to detraining scenarios, or to unloading as well. So what happens is that if there is an increase in muscle thickness, obviously this is all bidimensional, right? But if we have an increase in muscle thickness, the mechanism that can bring this increase in muscle thickness are the increase in pronation angle, so you have more fibers packed in a given length, or the increase in fascicle length, which reflects an addition of sarcomeres placed in series. Professor Larici, in 1999, wrote one of the papers that I still read from time to time, so I'm very happy about that, and showed that we can simply apply trigonometric parallelogram formula to the fascicle, obviously in a simplified manner, to calculate the length of the fascicles, because what's the problem? Shantam said it before, with ultrasound we don't see the whole muscle, we see parts of it, and sometimes the fascicles are even longer than the field of view. So what happens is that maybe, if this is the muscle, we see maybe a little bit of a part here, and then we have to extrapolate the fascicle length. Marco, when he wrote this paper, he suggested that this formula was very, very good for example, muscle with short fascicles, or shorter fascicles, for example, tibialis anterior or gastrocnemius medialis. Also, this has been shown to be good for vastus lateralis. But there are some muscles in which this, in my opinion, is not possible. So, for example, this is the image that this group, and with 9 more articles, they show about biceps femoris long head. This is the 50%. So if I have to make either a trigonometric evaluation or an estimation just linearly, taking the aponeurosis here and the fascicle here, probably we're going back to Monte Grotto to find the end of the fascicle, right? So this is a problem, because on these papers, there are many, many papers on sports medicine that show that they can prevent injuries based on these estimations. And this is, in my opinion, not good at the moment. So I've been given the opportunity to work with these athletes, and I said, why not do some imaging of the biceps femoris long head? So this is an extended field of view image that I made from the 30% of the length, counting that this is 0 and this is 100, and to the 60%. And I compare it to the field of view, which is taken at 50%. So you can see that actually the fibers look quite different here than here. Okay? And what have I done is that I also had to identify the whole muscle by ultrasound, and you see that the pattern of the muscle is actually not easy. So this is a very difficult muscle to image by ultrasound, and to be sure that you're imaging something that is right. Okay. What I've done is that I created an extended field of view, which is basically a panoramic image of the muscle, and I compare it to the 50%. So if you extrapolate it with linear extrapolation, you lose the curvature of the fascicles here, and you lose the curvature of the aponeurosis. So this is already 5 centimeters. The image that I showed you before is 4.7 centimeters. They use trigonometric equation, and the extrapolation, okay, the total non-visible part, this accounts for the 73% of the total length of the fascicle. So you're basically having values of something that you don't know if it's there or not. So I compared the two main used trigonometric equation, one validated from Blažević, suggested by Mark in 1999, and one validated by Taya, Finney, and Paavo Komi in Jyväskylä. And if you compare the fascicle length obtained by the panoramic image, you see that there is a substantial difference. Okay? When you do Bland-Altman's plot, you can see that the bias is close to 1.91 centimeter of difference. Which means that if we take the average sarcomere length of the biceps femoris long head from cadaver studies, which is 2.61 micron, And if there is a bias of overestimation of almost 2 centimeters, you overestimate, in theory, counting if the sarcomere length is optimal and all constant, more than 7,000 sarcomeres are there. So this was one of the parts of this study, was for me to understand how heterogeneous is the architecture of the biceps long head. And you can see, this is another study, one on extended field of view. You can see that the fascicle length differs. And so, this is not the best image, right? But this is to make a point that also the pennation angle may differ here with the fascicle length. So I said to myself, before starting this study, I said, okay, if the architecture is heterogeneous, then it means that the muscle must be something in a functional way to have a reason to have this architecture that heterogeneous along the length of the muscle. So I went to look a little bit into this biceps femoris elongate. And one of the trendy exercise now the people do is the Nordic hamstring exercise. So basically you have fixed your calf and your ankle, and then you go down resisting, okay, to your body weight, or to your body weight plus an overload if you want to do an overload. So actually this muscle seems to work eccentrically, seems to work like in a lengthening way. And I showed you this because this is a map of activation of muscle activity taken from high density EMG. And what you see is the distal and proximal part of the muscle. There is actually a difference between the two parts during activation too. So there's a heterogeneous architecture between distal and proximal, which I showed you before. And there's also a quite difference. So here we are around 70% of activation, and here we are a little bit more, so close to 90. Okay? So also the activation is a little bit different. So I said to myself, what can I do on this cohort to see if there is any difference in properties that integrate mechanical and structural properties, or also activation related properties. So I had the opportunity and the luck to work with some machine that did shear wave elastography. And so what's shear wave elastography? Basically, there's an ultrasound probe. Okay, he sends a pulse, and which is basically perpendicular to the direction of the probe. This wave propagates and they come back, and this probe and this machine is able to measure the velocity of the propagation of this wave, which is related basically to the components of the tissue, to the mechanical properties, so the viscoelastic property of the tissue. And this is what you get usually. This is a muscle. You have a map here, which is in kilopascals. So this is actually a calculation of a shear wave modulus. And what happens is that you will have this map blue or yellow or red, and usually it's proportion to the stiffness or to the activity of the muscle. So what we've done, what I suggested to do to Jorg, was to have a regional test of shear wave elastography pre and post 6 Nordic hamstring exercise in the cohort of the 42 athletes, so from the national team, and the 107 guys that were 12 to 15. So in addition to all the architectural parameters that we assessed. And you'll probably be able to see by eye what's happening here a little bit. So this has been taken, this measurement, from a passive shortening, a passive elongation of a muscle in a range of motion on circa 85 degrees. So this is counted as 0. That's somebody that with a constant velocity, well, mostly constant velocity, moves it. I'm here with the probe. This is the proximal side. This is the shear wave. This, I don't know if it's a guy or a girl, but it's one of the athletes of the national team. And what happens is that you have a curve that starts from 0, goes to 85, and then go back to 0 again. Okay, so these are basically the properties that we see of the viscoelastic properties throughout range of motion on a passive shortening and a passive elongation. So this, you can see that on the pre, we are about here on kilopascal, and then only distally, post only 6 repetition of Nordics, we have an increase in stiffness. Now, this is what happens basically in the 42 the national team athletes. So that there's actually the muscle is stiffer at the distal side, so it's different architecture. There is a different activation during Nordic hamstring, and the stiffness also changes and increases in an heterogeneous way, if you can see it. When we went to look at the 107 alpine skiers, actually there's no change, or there's very, very little change, but it's not significant in this part. And this is also why, I think I have to look, I have received this data 2 days ago. So I have to look more into it, but the architecture of the biceps femoris long head in young skiers is different, is less heterogeneous than in the young guys. So the fascicle are longer, and then we develop, and then we train, and probably our fascicle of the biceps femoris become shorter. And this is what I think is also one possible reason. So there's less strain basically arising onto the Martino's junction. Now, why these things are a little bit important? Because if we want to quantify the amount of strain that is in the muscle, so this is a very bidimensional way, it's not three-dimensional unfortunately, but we can work on that, I'm sure. But if we want to understand how a muscle also responds to different mechanical stimuli, we need to take into account heterogeneity of structure, of activation, and potential of the viscoelastic property that are resulting of the shears that are in the muscle. So this is just to show you where we would like to go, or where we are going, or what I would like to take to Padova to, if there is a chance. We basically try to combine three-dimensional ultrasound with elastography, with shear wave elastography. So what we do is that we get scans, volumetric reconstruction, segmentation of the muscle of interest, in this case the vastus lateralis, and then we obtain something like this. Something that is like a three-dimensional map of the vastus lateralis of the shear wave velocity. So in theory you could look at this in differences between superficial and deep compartments, differences at different sites along the length, or at different sites or more medial, central or lateral. So these are very, very preliminary. After 15 seconds of just isometric knee extension. Okay, only 15 seconds. So there is the response of the shear wave elastography is different, or has been seen to be different, because it started in 2015 on muscle, but it seemed to be different at different contraction modes. So after eccentric, there are two reports that suggest that there is an increase in shear wave elastography modulus, and after isometric, so after fatiguing protocol, there is actually a decrease. But look at here. Counting the 70 is actually the distal point, okay? So I took 70% of the vastus lateralis length, and 0 is actually the more proximal point. If one takes shear wave elastography only from one side, only from the middle, yes, there is possibly a decrease. But what about the last part, the Martino's junction? There is an increase. So I think that with this three-dimensional, also in this subject, in this three-dimensional approach, we could use these techniques to better understanding what's happening in the whole muscle and in the whole muscle length, and perhaps between muscles. So we know exactly we try to know what's the contribution between the two muscles of shear forces and lateral force transmission between muscles as well. Maybe this is just something that can be done also on the patella tendon. This is another application. But you know, if we apply also the three-dimensional reconstruction on tendon, in theory we could be able to understand if there are potential spots where there is something going on. Remodeling, tendinopathy, and so on. So I hope that I told you a little bit more about this technique, which is also newer to me, and thank you very much for the invitation. Yes, so what's going on is that on this cohort, which are skiers, we don't have many strain injuries.
No. You know the biceps femoris is always injured very often in sprinting, in sprinters. Yeah? Have you any, from your experience, relation between the injury of sprinters and your finding on skiers?
That's one application where I think that not only me or my, I should say my old group now, but that they want to go. And there are some groups that are going to that direction too. That probably will try to do elastography in the same way. This is a good question because many of the people that are studying injury prevention on biceps femoris are the ones that use a very small field of view to image fascicle length, and then they plot it to force. And they call it something called quadrant of doom. So if you have shorter fascicle and shorter amount of force, you are doomed to have an injury. But the problem is that those fascicle numbers go until 15 centimeters. And in cadaver, we found the bigger length that we find is 9.66 centimeters. So what I'm saying is that I hope that there's going to be new research that goes into that with these techniques, because the one that we have now is wrong. That's it.
More questions?
I mean, in answer to your question, Mr. I mean, wouldn't it be likely to be near the tendon surface? If the Achilles tendon, it basically ruptures at the Achilles tendon. I mean, finally, the model will show that's the highest point of stress.
Yes.